So a doula says, well, where's the 16? Who's going to drive you to doctor's appointments and pick up the kids and organise the meals and do the shopping and mow the lawns? And how are all those 16 people going to communicate? And who's going to attend the doctor's appointments? Who's going to relay that information? Because, you try keeping 16 people on the same page. So a doula can look at all of this coordination, logistics and planning stuff, as well as doing the heart work. Do you want to write letters to your kids? What's going to happen to grandma's recipes or your great-grandfather's tools in the shed? So it's such a rich and diverse role, and it really is why I say they're a blank slate, because when they go into a family or into a community or into a friend group, not everyone has the family structure, but when a doula walks into that space, there's so much they could do, but it's about what do you need?
Welcome to Don't Be Caught Dead, a podcast encouraging open conversations about dying and the death of a loved one. I'm your host, Catherine Ashton, founder of Critical Info, and I'm helping to bring your stories of death back to life. Because while you may not be ready to die, at least you can be prepared. Don't Be Caught Dead acknowledges the lands of the Kulin Nations and recognises their connection to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and First Nation peoples around the globe. Rebecca Lyons, mother of one, hails from the Blue Mountains in New South Wales. She started her working career in Sydney before making the move to Tasmania in late 2006. Over her career, she has worked in various industries, including finance, real estate and the law. But in 2011, she found her path into the funeral industry and stayed there until mid-2017. She worked across many roles offered in the contemporary funeral industry, including planning, administration, mortuary, funeral arranging and directing. Retraining as an end-of-life doula and becoming an independent funeral director, she has worked in home-based death care and family-led funerals ever since. Beck has also been actively working to advance the mission of Yuan Taboo, which is the education and advocacy service she co-founded with her partner in 2016. Most recently, Beck was awarded a Churchill Fellowship to undertake international research and report on changes and disruptions in the end-of-life space, which saw her travel through 6 countries exploring alternatives to contemporary ceremony and body disposal. In her spare time, she enjoys reading, writing, photography, camping, and travel, but what makes her most contented is time with her family. The subjects of death and dying, natural burial, and the do-it-yourself approach to death care are her passion, and she loves being out in the community raising awareness and promoting good, honest conversations. She is a dedicated advocate for positive change. She also happens to be the president of Australia's Natural Death Advocacy Network and the chair of the Australian Home Funeral Alliance. Thank you for being a guest on the show, Beck.
Thank you for enduring that really long introduction.
Now, Beck, you trained as an end-of-life doula. Can you please explain what that is and the training that's involved?
Yeah, so there's a handful of people doing training in Australia. I have been lucky enough to train with or be connected in some way to pretty much all of them. I did my first lot of training through Preparing the Way, which are now the people who are delivering the RTO, which is the actually world's first certificate in end-of-life doula. So that's the world's first government-accredited sort of doula training. I've also done training through Zen Virago out of Byron with the Death Walker training. I've done Denise Love's training. So they're the ones that I have undertaken. But, there's another couple of really good people who are also delivering doula training and end-of-life consultant training. At the moment, the training is largely unregulated. It's private training. That's why the Cert 4 is a bit of a game changer. And it's designed now. So what's come out of this Cert 4 is the need for better structure and organisation around doula. People who are now looking at a Cert 4 are going, so where's your governing body and your professional representation and all that sort of stuff. So there is this shift to, I guess, professionalising doula, and that's going to both increase the training options but also delineate between, I guess, what is accredited and non-accredited training as well.
And what is training, what is an end-of-life doula?
An end-of-life doula is a non-medical asset, a non-medical person who comes in at any point of an end-of-life journey. It could be when someone is still well and has no diagnosis but wants to do planning. It could be there's been a terminal or a life-limiting diagnosis and they need to understand that and start looking at what services are available and how to connect with supports. It could be that someone is dying and family and community or the person that's dying actually need better support and a person to help navigate that space. So a doula really comes in as a blank slate, but with a lot of information. So they come in as a blank slate going, what do you need? Tell me about your situation and let me try and work out how I can best support you and what your needs are and what your wishes are and how can we make that happen for you. And it's an increasingly important role because we know things like, it's the figures have been bandied around for ages now. We know that over 70% of people say they want to die at home, and about 14% of people across Australia achieve that. We know that, the figures on the projected death rates. So in 2019, there was 169,301 deaths recorded in Australia. And that, if you look at the population prospectus through the UN modelling and also the ABS data, that could be up to 430,000 by 2056. And so that's an increase of, about 156%, I think it is. And, if you go to any hospice, hospital, palliative care service, community nurses, hospice at home, even a funeral director, and you go, your market share or your client base is going to increase by 156%, they're going to go, we don't have the staff, like we can't cope with what we've got now. And so we need to start looking at what are the alternatives, how can we support people? And then you match that with the idea that, 70% of people say they want to die at home. So why aren't they? Because there's not the right supports, and a doula comes into that to try and negotiate some of those supports, and sometimes it's not possible. Death at home is not always possible, but it's certainly more possible than what is currently being achieved. And so a doula looks at all sorts of things around communication, logistics, planning. There's stuff in the Western Sydney University that says it takes a team of 16 people to care for someone who's going to die at home. So a doula says, well, where's the 16? Who's going to drive you to doctor's appointments and pick up the kids and organise the meals and do the shopping and mow the lawns? And how are all those 16 people going to communicate? And who's going to attend the doctor's appointments? Who's going to relay that information? Because, you try keeping 16 people on the same page. So a doula can look at all of this coordination, logistics and planning stuff, as well as doing the heart work. Do you want to write letters to your kids? What's going to happen to grandma's recipes or your great-grandfather's tools in the shed? So it's such a rich and diverse role, and it really is why I say they're a blank slate, because when they go into a family or into a community or into a friend group, you know, not everyone has the family structure, but when a doula walks into that space, there's so much they could do, but it's about, what do you need? What can we do for you?
Talking openly about death and grief can sometimes be triggering. If you find you need support, please reach out to our support services and the bereavement organisations listed on our resource hub. All links are in the show notes of this episode. That's quite a comprehensive role.
Yes, it is.
And tell me, you're also an independent funeral director and you offer family-led funerals where you live in Tasmania. Can you talk me through the services you offer and how that perhaps differentiates from a conventional funeral service?
I am a little bit different. So, and a lot of that has to do with my ways of operating. And it's, you know, it's probably not very good business sense. I have been told that I don't have very good business sense. So, you know, you may still find me packing shelves at Woolworths at some point. But the whole idea for me is it's got to be about family and community. So I do come out of that industry, and, you know, that's, you know, the bio that you read. I spent quite a few years in the funeral industry, and I just wanted to have something that was different. And so I've been very mindful about how I do what I do and how to make that different. And it's not that I want it to be different from a marketing point of view, because, you know, one, you'd need to have a marketing budget for that, and I don't. But I want the heart of it to feel different. And I guess that's where the doula and funeral director kind of intersect a little bit, because I have written $15,000 bills in the funeral industry. I have seen the look on people's faces when they get bills they weren't expecting, or when they see on the estimate of costs what that's going to be and they don't know how to say no, like, we need to rethink this. I wanted to have a service where people were not necessarily just making financial choices. They were making choices that felt good. I think we're doing people out of ceremony with you know, these concepts. So, you know, funeral poverty is a thing. There's a, you know, 2017, there was a report written from, you know, the Business School of Business in Sydney Uni. You know, funeral poverty is a thing. The cost of funerals is going up, and people are opting for having no ceremony. And that's, you know, becoming a financial choice. And so I wanted to be able to say, let's rethink what a funeral is. Let's reimagine what that could be. And that was the point of the TED Talk. It was the point of all, like, the work that I'm doing. It's like, what if you just paid for a direct committal with no service or ceremony? So I do because I can do a full funeral, and I do full, lovely, beautiful funerals for people, but you also don't need a funeral director. Like, a funeral director is not necessarily even a legal requirement for most things in most places. So what if, you know, you did just pay for the bare necessity, but then let's talk about what your funeral could be. Is it campfire in the backyard sharing stories? Is it a high tea at your grandmother's favourite, you know, fancy cafe? Is it, you know, your parent was an avid bushwalker, so you're going to get all the friends together and go for a bushwalk, and everyone brings a quiche and has a picnic? Like, a funeral could be all of those things. A funeral could be gathering people, making sure, you know, on the afternoon that someone dies, making sure that Dad's got his boots on because he was never seen without them, and spending that time with him before your funeral director comes and takes them away. Like, if we start to reimagine what a funeral could be, then suddenly people can have the heart things that will support the grief and bereavement, but not necessarily the bills that go with them. And so I run a very different business model. I tend not to mark things up. So I charge for my time and my costs and my equipment, but I don't put, like, if for example, if a family wants $300 worth of flowers, I will order $300 worth of flowers and charge $300 for the flowers because that's what I've paid. So I don't add markups to things in that respect. And I try to, with particularly home funerals, so a lot of what I encourage is, would you like to dress your person yourself? Would you like to have them at home? They don't need to come with me. We can keep them at home. You can be the carer. This is your person. And, what might that look like? And at the end of it, this is the compassionate communities point of it, because at the end of that, the family and the community, they have these new skills and these new knowledge, and they might not need a funeral director ever again. They might invite me back because they want me there next time, but they're not going to necessarily need me. And that's what I mean about not very good business. It's like, it's not a great business model, but this is the point. It's people doing for people.
And was there any particular incident in your life that led you to, I suppose, develop this very personal approach to funerals?
Yeah, I was already on a bit of a trajectory of looking at how things could be different. In about 2016, my partner and I had these conversations around, it's amazing the amount of people that walk through the door of a funeral home that don't have a clue. They do not have a clue. They go, I'm like in my 50s, 60s, no one's ever died before. What's possible? What could we do? What are the options? And so there was a real lack of death literacy in that space. And so we started out really wanting to just raise death literacy, in our local community. And then my great aunt died, and that was 2018. And by that stage, I'd left the industry to start pursuing some of this other work. But when I was working as a doula, but when she died, the nursing home wouldn't allow me to take her body. And I had this knockdown, drag out argument with the CEO of the chain. I went right up, and he was like, "No, sorry, you're not a funeral director." I'm like, "I've been a funeral director for years. I know what I'm like." No, he wouldn't release the paperwork to me. And, I had a chat with the beautiful, Libby Maloney and my partner and all that. And I said, look, I'm going to have to be a funeral director again. So we decided that would never happen to anyone else ever again. And so, I did get a home because I still had friends in the industry who very, very generously said, whatever you need, Beck. And they went and helped and officially took possession of the paperwork and took my great aunt straight to my house, which, was beautiful. But had I not known people in the industry, that wouldn't have happened.
And so, who is Libby Maloney?
So Libby runs a place in Melbourne called Natural Grace. I've known Libby for many years, and she was actually one of the founding members of the Natural Death Advocacy Network.
And how did she assist you in this incident?
We just talked through. So there wasn't any practical assistance. She's in Melbourne, I'm in Tasmania, but it was the affirming conversation of, yep, so this is the problem. This is the problem with home funeral. It's that, people think they own the body when they don't. And one of the only ways around that is to advocate. And in my case, it was I then went and jumped through all the hoops again to become a funeral director, but an independent funeral director. And so that's how I am operating today. So as a doula and an independent funeral director now, I can come in when there's a terminal or a life-limiting diagnosis, say. Even when people are well, I come in, I work with them as a doula, I do planning for people, and then when people die, I stay on and be their funeral director.
Fantastic. And so that period that you were talking about was that 2017 period when you established You and Taboo with Edwin?
Yeah, so You and Taboo started in 2016. We actually launched it for Dying to Know Day, 2016. 2017 was when I left the big industry and did my doula training. And then 2018, Aunt died. Yeah. And it was later that year, it was the 2018 that I got the Churchill. So yeah, so it was just kind of this confluence of events that was all pointing me one after the other in exactly the same direction.
And you mentioned the Australian Home Funeral Alliance briefly before. So you're the president of the Alliance, and also the chair of the Natural Death Advocacy Network. Can you give me a little bit of insight in relation to both of these organisations? You know, what are they? What do they do? What's their role? And who's on the board?
Yeah, so that's also changed rather recently, but NDAN, so the Natural Death Advocacy Network, they have been around. It'll be coming up to 10 years next year, and so that's kind of exciting, a 10-year anniversary. But NDAN was put together initially by Dr. Pia Interlandi. She brought together a group of people that came out of some conversations and some really at the time forward-thinking people who were willing to invest time and energy into trying to build something different, something around natural death, natural burial here in Australia. So Pia had been working as a funeral director in a natural burial ground in the UK, and she'd come back with all of these sort of ideas and experiences. She's also, she's done her PhD is the reason we know about materials and how they decompose in natural burial. So she'd done this really kind of formative work, and she gathered a bunch of people who were really interested in supporting this, and so NDAN was formed. I took over NDAN in 2021, I think. Must be 2020. And that was, Pia was sort of ready to do something different with her life, and a few of the other board members were ready to kind of, go in other directions and do some other work. And so I came into NDAN and really tried to refocus it back to just natural burial. And so what NDAN have been doing in the last few years have been info sessions every 2 months, looking at different body disposal technologies around the world and environmentally friendly or alternate approaches. And we've now just in the last few weeks launched natural burial accreditation across Australia. So that's going to be a work in progress. But the idea is that we've contacted every cemetery saying they offer natural burial across Australia and invited them to step into a process of membership with us, so that they can have our tick of approval, and so that there's a level of integrity with the consumers and with the public as to the type of natural burials being offered by any particular cemetery in the country. So that's work ongoing. But so in NDAN, we've got myself as president, Alex Antunes as our treasurer, Heidi Gregg is on the committee, Jessica Xavier is the vice president, Joe Lincoln, Fiona McQuaig, Dee Stokes, and Hayley West, and Rose Sexton. So that's a really robust committee of beautiful women running NDAN. For the Australian Home Funeral Alliance, that actually started out of my Churchill. So at the end of the Churchill report, there's a bunch of, I think it's 20 something recommendations, but I looked at them and went, what's the biggest bang for the buck? And there were a few things happening in the doula space, and I'd had a chat to a couple of people, Annetta and Pia, and sort of said, this is, I think we've got to do this. And we were keen to get it off the ground. And so I reached out to a bunch of people. I put everyone in a room and said, this is what came out of my Churchill. I think we could form a charity to promote and educate home funeral so that we can stamp out the space for home funeral. We can start to set the narrative about what a home funeral is, and we can sort of build the definitions and the vision for that for Australia. And so that's what we did. And we spent hundreds of hours between us really storyboarding and putting all that together. And last year we got charity status through the ACNC. So we're now a registered charity looking at educating people and communities about home funerals and community-led approaches. So we've developed a workshop, or we're in the process of finishing a workshop at the moment, which will be hopefully a 2-day thing that we get funding to roll out, because we'd like to offer it free to the community. And the idea behind it is it's not training for a profession. What it is a way to bring community together and skill a community so that when someone dies, there are people in that community who know what the options are, how to respond, what's possible, all that sort of stuff. So it's really community capacity building.
And you mentioned that previously about compassionate communities. Could you perhaps, if some people may not be familiar with that phrase, is that something you can expand on, please, Beck?
Yeah, so funnily enough, on our ARFA committee, because I'll tell you who's on our committee, we've got Kerry Noonan, Dr. Kerry Noonan, Tracy Rusden, Ros Wright, Claire Turnham, Hayley Halloran, Alex Antunes, Rachel Valentine, Kelly Beattie, and then we've got co-ops of Annie Whitlock, Shivani Patel, Dr. Pia Interlandis, Zenith Virago and Joe Fairley. So we've got, again, a huge amount of beautiful people stepping into this. But Dr. Kerry Noonan is one of, Australia's leading people on compassionate communities and death literacy and all sorts of things. But compassionate communities is a model of people looking after people. So it was started by a guy called Dr. Alan Kelleher, who was a Melbourne-based doctor who went to the UK. And he had this idea of, basically mobilising communities to care for people and building compassion again into the fabric of how you do what you do. And so there's a whole thing that happened in a place called Frome in the UK. Dr. Julian Abel and Helen Kingston sort of had, these ideas, and Helen was sort of starting to build things in Frome, and Julian said, well, let's look at how compassionate communities works, and it's been so successful there. There's been millions of pounds worth of savings in emergency hospital presentations. Like, they've been able to put a dollar figure on it now, and it's been so successful with the signposting to other services that they're getting like long-term funding now to run this program, which is phenomenal. And it's started to be tested and rolled out in different places around Australia too. But the idea behind compassionate communities really is it's people looking after people. It's training your local butcher and your newsagent and your hairdresser and your taxi driver and your police to identify what loneliness looks like. It's very light, easy training, but if they notice something with someone, they can ring a community connector and go, Mrs. Smith didn't come for her packet of sausages or whatever it is. And so, the health connector can reach out to Mrs. Smith and go, how are you doing? Are you okay? Has something changed with you? Can I help you at all? And she might say, oh, well, I'm not seeing very well. It's this macular degeneration. And so the connector can go, we've actually got a club. They meet every second Wednesday, for everyone with macular degeneration. So how about you come along and meet some other people, and we'll organise transport for you. And so it's a way of just connecting people. And yeah, and we're finding that keeps people out of medical services.
It sounds like it's based on a very old-fashioned way of just knowing your neighbour.
Yeah, it's kind of simple. right?
Yeah. And you've mentioned the Churchill Fellowship. So in 2019, you travelled to 6 countries. Tell me about that trip. What did it involve? What were you looking at?
Yeah, so my brief, what I pitched to the trust was to look at alternative approaches. So it was called the Human Relationship to Death and Ceremony through Alternate Approaches and Technologies. And so it was in 2 parts. It was about body disposal and different, the very kind of structural, mechanical, how are we doing dead bodies and what happens to them. But it was also, how are we doing ceremony and supporting people and bereavement and compassionate communities? Like, how does that look on the ground? And so I did visit several places doing different body disposals, but I also, I went to Froome. I met the people who were doing compassionate communities, and I met other compassionate communities in other places. And I met funeral directors who were doing things a little bit like me, and different approaches, people who were doing home funerals. I met a lot of end-of-life doulas, and, it was just this really kind of rich, broad, the part of my fellowship looked at death disruptions. So people who were doing things to disrupt the industry, and either cause people to think or talk or, question. So it was a really broad project. I did over 53 interviews in the end and traveled to 21 flights, 3 train journeys. Like, it was massive. And that was in 10 weeks.
And what was something that you saw overseas that you thought, I think that should come back to Australia?
Alkaline hydrolysis is probably the easiest to get, and that's not far off being here in a really set professional way.
And could you explain what that is, please?
Alkaline hydrolysis is a process of body disposal which uses water. So the body goes into a machine. That machine can be pressurized or unpressurized. The mixture is approximately 95% water and 5% alkaline. In a pressurized machine, it will go up to about 150 degrees. In non-pressurized, obviously, it's atmospheric temperature, so 100 degrees or whatever that is. But it's the movement of that water with the alkaline in it that basically dissolves every protein-based thing in the body to pre-DNA level. So there's no DNA left in the water. There's no, there's a whole bunch of media beat up that goes, an acid bath. And it's like, no, alkaline's the opposite of acid. Just, I'm not a scientist, but I do know that. But there's no atmospheric pollution with alkaline hydrolysis. So it is a way of getting remains. So what comes out of that machine is then this, beautiful white bone. And then anything foreign, like, artificial joint or something. One of the perks of alkaline hydrolysis is that you can't put anything in the body that's unnatural. So, for example, if the person's body's had an autopsy and all the organs are in a viscera bag in the cavity, they have to come out of that bag. The plastic can't go into the machine. You can't pack someone's nose or throat with cotton because the cotton will have, there are actually, I met funeral directors in America who are packing people and then unpacking them, which is, I think, a whole bunch of messy that you don't need. There's, you wouldn't stitch a mouth, you wouldn't put plastic eye caps in. So the body gets to be very naturally treated for this process. And of course, you don't need a coffin. There's no coffin that goes in to that machine either. The person is either shrouded in silk. Some places will use like a silk bag because silk is a protein-based fibre. So you can only use protein-based fibres because they will be dealt with the same way as the protein base in our bodies.
Is this what some people refer to as water cremation?
It's got a lot of names, and I think we need to be careful how we talk about it. So there are some places that call it water cremation, some places call it aquamation, some places and there are different versions of it. So what I'm talking about is the very officially sanctioned, all government water service approved alkaline hydrolysis. There are other offerings where the water is not necessarily allowed back into the water cycle because there's no approvals. And, so that means that the water is having to be dealt with in a very different way, and it's not necessarily environmentally friendly. So what we're talking about is totally approved and government stamped kind of process that then allows the water to go back into the water cycle at the correct sort of pH, and then the bones become the remains. They would go through, I guess, a grinding process, the same as what happens out of flame cremation, and becomes the ashes that people know and are familiar with, that would then go back to the family. But it's got it does have a lot of names, but we've got to separate what the process is called from what the business offering is. So, there's aquamation, there's resomation, there's water cremation, there's all of these things. But the process, alkaline hydrolysis.
And whereabouts is in the world where you've seen it, is that currently happening and to the approved standards that you're talking about?
America, I've seen it. I saw it in 2 different places from 2 different companies that are offering 2 different things. But I've seen 2 versions of it. But I know that one of those companies now has it, I believe, operational in the Netherlands, or it's about to be. The UK, I think the approvals are there now as well. So it's starting to happen around the world, yeah.
And how long, from what you've seen, how long does the process take?
Depends on whether the machine's pressurised or unpressurised. So unpressurised, I guess anywhere between, I would say, 8 to 12 hours. Pressurised, probably 4 to 6.
Okay, fantastic. So that's something that's overseas. Coming back to Australia, what are the laws around having a funeral and in relation to disposing of a body in Australia?
There's actually not a lot that you have to do when someone dies. You have to register a death. You have to look after the body in accordance with the state legislation, and you have to organise a body disposal. So there's different states have different time limits on all of that stuff. But, there's probably less legal stuff than people think. So can you keep a body of a person at home? Yes. For days? Sure. But you need to maintain in most places a body temperature of, say, 5 degrees or less. Are there ways to do that? Absolutely, multiple ways of doing that. So there's, there's not, you don't have to call a funeral director as soon as someone dies. You can go, and as Zen Farago says, don't pick up the phone, pick up the kettle. Go and have a cup of tea and just sit with yourself and that person for a little while, because you'll never get that time back. So, there's a lot that there's laws in different states around transport. In some places you can transport your person, but it's got to be done in a certain way. Mostly it's around not being what they call injurious to public health. And that means you just don't see the body, right? So use a coffin, or use if you're going to have a shrouded body on a shroud carrier, use the back of a ute that's got a canopy on it. Make sure that, things are strapped down so that there's nothing, no awkward movement if you have to slam the brakes on. You have to be sensible about this stuff. But, and then you've got to look at policies. So some policies will say, oh, it has to be a funeral director that brings the body to the cemetery or something like that. So, but it's kind of hard to go, what are the laws, because they're different in every state. The Australian Home Funeral Alliance website has on all states. We're still missing a couple of territories at the moment, but all of the state-based law and how to have a home funeral is state by state written on our website.
Okay, so if someone was interested in having a home funeral, that's where they could go to actually find out more information?
100%.
And could they even ask their local funeral director?
Yep, they can. And I would suggest doing the reading first, so, which I know is a bit arduous for people, but if you know what's possible, that can help inform the conversations you're going to have with your local funeral directors, because the reality is not everyone wants to do everything themselves, and that's okay. But the more informed people are, the better they can advocate for themselves in what they want, and knowing what's possible helps them do that.
So you don't have to transport the body. You could do certain parts at home and have someone else take care of it for you?
Absolutely. But it's about going, oh, I don't have to call a funeral director straight away. So if my person dies at 3:00 in the afternoon, they can hang out with me for the day, and I can go and find, what I want to wrap them in or dress them in, and I can get my mate to come round tomorrow morning and help me do that before the funeral directors come. Absolutely, they don't have to be gone as soon as they die. Or, if someone's in a hospital or in an institution, they might go, well, we don't want them to come to our house, but we also don't want them to go straight away. So what does that look like? Well, can I just have the evening here? Yeah, absolutely. Or I do want them at home, but I don't want to put them in the back of the station wagon. So can I get my local funeral director just to pick them straight up from where they've died at, the whatever nursing home, and bring them to my house? And also, does your local funeral director have a cooling plate or some Techni ice or a massage table, something that we can use to lay them out at home? So if you know what's possible, you can direct, and you'll know what questions to ask so that you land on exactly what it is that's right for you.
And is this information that they can get off the NDAN website or the Home Funeral Alliance website, those sort of contacts in their local area that they could reach out to?
There are, on the ARFA website, there is a list of home funeral friendly funeral directors. That's a mouthful. But also don't just ring, don't just stick to that list. Like the way we get some of this stuff over the line with people is by community asking. So even if your local funeral director isn't on that list, and let me tell you, it's not a big list at the moment, but even if your local funeral director isn't on it, still bring them and go, I know that this is possible. Would your business be open to a conversation about that? Would you engage me in conversation? Could we talk about what that might look like? This is what I want to do. Is this something you'd be open to exploring, offering? Have you done this before? Have you heard of the Home Funeral Alliance? If you want more information, would you be willing to reach out to them and learn a little bit more? There's, by people asking, the industry responds.
And do you suggest, if this is something that someone is interested after hearing this interview, who is it best that they actually sort of undertake those questions now and that research now?
Long before you need it. You always best served doing your planning before you need the plans, because the planning that you do when you're well and the planning that you do when someone might have died and it's prompted you to go, really don't have my paperwork in order or whatever it is, or I'd really love to be buried on private land, but how do I do it? What does that look like? So that kind of planning is a much less stressful and a much more considered planning than the planning of, oh no, my person's just been hit by a car and they died 2 hours ago and now I'm left reeling and I don't know what to do and there's nothing in place. That planning, that kind of acute setting, emergency, grief-stricken planning is a very different type of planning.
And so you just mentioned there, Beck, that you could actually be buried in your own land. Was that right?
Totally, yeah.
So that's possible in different states, is it?
Absolutely, absolutely. Burial on private land is a thing that people have been doing for a very long time. It's the environmental officer usually of your local council. That's where you start. You go and you say, I want to be buried on private land, and they will give you a shopping list of things, of, hoops to jump through and all the rest of it. And then, by the time you've done your investigations, or people send me those shopping lists every now and then, so I'll do some negotiation with local councils for people in my area. So most of my local councils now, there's not even a question. They're well educated. and that's all it takes. It just takes a couple of times to do the process. There'll probably be a site inspection. They'll want to know what size land you've got. They'll have all of these, requirements. But once you've got that permission, as far as certainly where I am, but as far as I know, it doesn't go out of date. It just, change. It might change if you sell the property. And I know I've got a client who's in the process of trying to put a caveat on the land so that if she has to sell the property and go into care, she's still allowed to be back there to be buried. So yeah, it's quite a thing. There's more than one way to do something. You just got to think outside the box a little bit, funnily enough.
Tell me, you mentioned earlier on about natural burial and the fact that there is now an accreditation process through the Natural Death Advocacy Network. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me a little bit about that and what is natural burial?
So natural burial is burial in, the core part of it is that it's a burial in shallow depth grave. So it's a burial where you're in what they call the aerobic layers of the soil. And that's where you've got all the nice little bugs and the bacteria and the movement of oxygen and water through that soil, which all aids the decomposition process. So you're a single depth burial, so only one body per plot. You're only digging about 1.2 metres deep. You're looking at the conservation of the land around it. You're looking at what goes into that grave, so it's natural fibres. So the body can be wearing plant or protein-based materials, and that's, Dr. Pia Intolandi's research about the kinds of fibres that can go into natural burial, where, you're not doing the chemical preparations or any you're not putting plastic eye caps in and all of that stuff that happens in standard mortuary. So it's very natural care.
Sorry, Beck, when you say chemicals, is that what the embalming process is? Is that chemical process?
Embalming is a chemical process, but also just standard chemical washes often happen in mortuaries too. Just to, all over kind of wash of the person's body, and there's all sorts of chemicals. And embalming is a bit of a double-edged sword in a lot of ways. We certainly not encouraging embalming, and it's not great. It's not the amount of embalming fluid that goes into the earth every year in the Western world is not. It's something ridiculous. The American figures are like 19 million litres of embalming fluid a year. It's huge. We're nothing like that in Australia, but the criticism of embalming fluid, the biggest criticism is the substance, which is formaldehyde. And I'm not a scientist, but my understanding is that, there are elements of formaldehyde found in the natural decomposition process of a body anyway. So I don't know, and I don't think the research has been done as to what the change in composition to the soil is if you have an embalmed body as opposed to an unembalmed body. So one of the biggest problems with embalming is actually what happens to the embalmer in the mortuary. Like, it's the exposure at that level that's really terrible. But yeah, embalming aside, you try and do everything chemical free as much as you can. And that's, people see that as gentler as well. So there's, and then you get into, you can put compost matter into the grave, and you can put sticks and twigs and things that will create, oxygen corridors and all sorts of things. You can get quite fancy with it. You can do flora and fauna surveys of the area and look at, where there's natural burial, conservation burial places that are seeing the reintroduction of species. So there's all of this sort of beautiful stuff that happens. But essentially that is natural burial, and you can do it on private land if you can get your council permission. We have a couple of natural burial grounds in development in Australia as standalone sites, which is really exciting. There's one in development in New South Wales. There's another couple, in other states as well. And here down at Tassie, we've just had a cemetery set aside, a portion of land which is going to be for a natural burial area as well. So it's starting to take up, but we are way behind because in the UK there's like 80 accredited ones and well over 100 natural burial grounds.
And what do they look like? Are they different to what your normal traditional, I suppose, or conventional burial ground would be?
Yeah, they are. So, and there's all different ways of doing it. So you can do field, farm, or bush. And they can be, there's also the concept of conservation burial, which is different again. But so you can have it so that you are still grazing sheep, cutting hay, like the agricultural value of the land can continue with natural burial. There are places that are still doing those things. They've got fruit trees, bees, like they're still, operating as part of farms even while bodies are being buried. But there's also bush style ones where they're rewilding and they're planting as they go, as they bury. There's other ones where there's an amazing place in the UK, which I believe you're aware of, called Dalton, and they are burying bodies in, land that's been in his family for 700 years. Like, it is this thick, foresty kind of, the tree canopy is just one great big hug, and they are burying bodies, and like he's got to get it resurveyed every year because he doesn't want to disturb the tree roots too much. And there's so many different ways that you can do it.
And Beck, from your personal experience and what you've seen certainly as a funeral director and being an end-of-life doula, what do you suggest when people are trying to work through administration after a loved one has died? Like, where should they start? We've talked a little bit about planning beforehand, but if someone has died, what do they prioritise?
At the point of death, you need to prioritise what feels right. Because that's that's two questions, I think, because what do you prioritise when someone's died is different to how do you attack the administration? Like, the administration comes and it kind of, life will force you into dealing with that administration, particularly if you need probate or anything like that. But the first few days after someone dies, you have to really just sort of step into what feels right. And sometimes, and that's one of the beauties of home funeral, is you get the space to do that. I tell this story about when my grandma died, and, she was at home with us for 5 days, and on the fourth night, the night before, that's the fifth night actually, the night before her ceremony, and my mum at 8 o'clock at night got up from the dinner table and went, "We didn't put face powder on her." And I was like, Ma, she does not need her face powder. And Mum was like, oh, no, she does. Yes, she does. And so here we are at 8 o'clock at night, all standing around my grandma, making sure she's got a lippy on and a face powder and all of this sort of stuff. That's not stuff that happens in a 2-hour viewing at a funeral home. But home funeral gives you the space to respond to your grief, and your grief gets to do what it needs to do when it needs to do it. And so I think it's really important that in whatever structure, whatever situation you've chosen, you give yourself the space to just do what feels right. In my dad's ceremony, we had this plan, right, where, because everyone said to me, you have to be the daughter at some point. You need to stop being the funeral director and start being the daughter. And so I was like, well, look, I'll open the ceremony and I'll sit down, and someone else, my partner, can be, he's a celebrant, he can do the celebrancy. And we got to this part in the ceremony and I went, you know what, I love you, but you need to sit down. I need to do the talking. And, you know, that's the stuff that will never happen in a big funeral chapel, but it's what my grief needed in that moment. And so you just need to be able to respond with what feels right. That's the thing. And if that's going to be outsourcing the things that are not important to you, like if you're doing home funeral, you can't do everything yourself, right? Home funeral, there is definitely more work to do. Do I think that's a good thing? Absolutely, because I wholeheartedly believe that grief is an emotion that needs something to do. But you can't do everything yourself. So in those first few days when someone dies, it's like, what is the heart for me? And then farm everything else out. That's what I think you need to do in the first few days.
That's very good advice. And given your experience, what have you done to prepare for your own death?
Well, I've written the ceremony. Anyone who knows me that's listening to this will go, of course she has. But I have put pen to paper, and literally pen to paper, it's not on computer, to write out the ceremony. And I've thought about, I believe a funeral should be an all-day. I'd love a funeral to be an all-day affair. So I've done a bit of planning around that. I have done some considerations about my advanced care plan, which, you know, in Tasmania we're all having to redo them now, so that I haven't redone mine yet. But, you know, I've got a power of attorney, I've got an enduring guardian, I've got a will, I've got all of the paperwork in order. But yeah, I think I spent so long thinking about it. Part of my thing with not having redone my advanced care directive yet is because I spent so long doing them for other people, and I keep learning new things. Or someone will say something to me and it's like, that's a fantastic idea. That's going in the toolkit. And then I'm like, I'll never be finished. How can I do mine?
And do you recall some of those things that you think, oh, that might go in the toolkit?
Oh, yeah. I had this great lesson quite a long time ago now with advanced care directives, and it was to always put some of the doing in there. So when people go, so advanced care directives, as you would know, are all about your wishes and how you want to be treated medically, and, you know, don't do this, life-prolonging treatments and medications and interventions and all of that stuff. But in the values section, you should always put something in there that's the doing. Because when people go to a bedside of someone who's dying, they're a little bit awkward sometimes if they're not used to being in that space. And so they might talk a lot, or they might want to feed you, or they might, like, it's all of the things that we nervously do to express our care because there's nothing that we actually know to do. And, we don't get a playbook when we leave year 12 going, and by the way, when your grandma dies, here's the things you need to do. Like, that doesn't happen, right? Actually, we should probably do that. Anyway, I'm thinking, like, I put in things like read to me, play me music, give me a foot massage, hold my hand. I put the doing things in there so that when people go to spend time with someone who's dying, they have something to do that they know is of value to that person. And I think that's a gift to all of your friends and family if you're dying, is to it's a way you can, as a dying person, still hold space for people and tell them what's important to you so that they're comfortable enough to spend more time with you. Because often you'll go, oh, look, I went to visit, but, she wasn't really responding, or she was non-responsive. And so I was probably only there for 5 or 10 minutes, or like we were there for half an hour, but, didn't feel right to sit on my phone scrolling. So, so we put things in there that other people can engage with and engage meaningfully with you because they know it's a value. That's probably one of the biggest things in the toolbox of when I do planning with people, because I just think that's such a beautiful, heart-centered thing to, do.
And it would remove that awkwardness and that not knowing what to do. I'm thinking Wordle or Word Find might be mine.
Brilliant. Needs to go in the advanced care directive. Even things like, I've been in there recently, I've been asking people and putting things in like, show me my old photographs, reminisce with me. Like all of that sort of stuff, what do you value? You value your people. Oh, would you value sharing some stories and memories with them, looking at old recipes or photos, or, oh, yeah, or I haven't seen those old photos in forever. That'd be great. Absolutely.
And what do you see from your experience being some of the biggest challenges that families face when a loved one is dying or has died?
Probably one of the biggest challenges is when there's no planning done and when they're playing guesswork. When no one has actually had the conversation and a family's just got to guess what that person might have wanted. And I've seen that go really wrong. Like to the point where when I was in the industry, a family came back to collect ashes, totally devastated because they'd just read the will, and which none of them had had a copy. And the will said he wanted to be buried in X, Y, and Z place and all the rest of it. And so, there's a lot of stuff that is then, the basis of trauma that happens because no one stepped into the conversation before they've needed it.
So, Beck, are there any cherished memories or traditions that you have from your family that you have then honoured in your own family?
There are, and it's actually been really bizarre for me the last couple of years because, in the last 4 years, I've had 5 funerals for my people, 5 years. And so all of that has changed really rapidly for me, particularly since 2021, because both my mum, my dad, and my brother have all died. And so what that landscape looks like for me is very different. But there are some things. I love having a fresh Christmas tree. And I'm not Christian. I don't necessarily, I don't celebrate Christmas, but I am pagan, so I have a Yule tree. And I love that. I love the scent and the smell, and I remember that from my childhood. And the baking, my grandmother, there is nothing that woman couldn't cook. And it didn't matter how many people turned up for dinner, there was always enough food, even when there wasn't any money for it. Like I actually don't know how she did it. I think she was magic. But I still have some of her recipes. So I love making, like the Christmas pudding recipe that I have is about 120, 130 years old. And it's, still all in ounces and pounds and all of that sort of thing. And so they're the things for me that bring back those memories. And yeah, it's very cathartic in some ways. And I've avoided it for the last year and a bit because it's still a bit painful at the moment. My mum was a Christmas nut. Everything that moved, jiggled, played jingle bells, sang, danced, she has it. There's like half a shed full of boxes of Christmas things. And so they're still sitting there. And I know that one day I will have to just get out and do a mum's Christmas. But yeah, at the moment I just love the smell of the pine in the house.
And Beck, you just mentioned that you have had your mum, your dad, and your brother die in short succession in the last few years, since 2021. How has your experience with the death industry, your training as a end-of-life doula, and also just your life experience with what you've seen, how has that helped you, with your grieving of your family?
It's helped me a lot in some ways and not in others. It's helped me in that I got to be the funeral director and the mortician, and, I took out my mum's pacemaker. Like I prepared the bodies of my people, and I got to do that and do it my way and know that I was the last person to do that for them. And I think that's the benefit of home funeral. It's the benefit of the skills and the knowledge that I have now, is that I think grief is different when the last thing you do for your person is an act of service and care. And for me, that's what it was. I got to be the last person to touch them and to care for them. And that meant something to me. The role of the funeral director itself in terms of ceremony, probably not as helpful to my grieving process, because I was the funeral director, and a funeral director has a job to do, and that job is to hold space for everyone in that place for ceremony. I was also the celebrant. So I wanted to be the one to do all of those things, and I, on the day of that, I think I didn't get the benefit of the ceremony, of being the person sitting receiving the ceremony, but I am really grateful to have been able to give that to everyone else. And I'm content that I know that's, particularly my mum, that's exactly what my mum would have wanted. And I think my brother would have really, and my dad would have really appreciated that too. So that's the double-edged sword, isn't it? I didn't get the benefit of the ceremony, but I got the knowledge that everyone else did, and that mattered.
I can't thank you enough for your time today, Beck. Is there anything else that you'd like to share?
No, I think we've covered a fair bit.
We certainly have. Thank you so much for your time, Beck.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of Don't Be Caught Dead, brought to you by Critical Info. If you liked the episode, learnt something new, or were touched by a story you heard, we'd love for you to let us know. Send us an email, even tell your friends. Subscribe so you don't miss out on new episodes. If you can spare a few moments, please rate and review us, as it helps other people to find the show. Are you dying to know more? Stay up to date with Don't Be Caught Dead by signing up to our newsletter and follow us on social media. Head to don'tbecaught.dead.com for more information and loads of resources.